there is a test that's performed. People have their noses and tonsils swabbed, and then a test called a PCR test is performed on that. And what they're looking for isn't the virus. You might think it's looking for the virus, but it's not. What they're looking for is a small piece of genetic sequence. It's called RNA. Unfortunately, that bit of RNA will be found in people's tonsils and nose, not if they've just caught the virus and they're about to get ill or they're already ill. It's also going to be found if they were infected previously, weeks or even sometimes a small number of months ago. Let me just explain why that is. If you've been infected and you've fought off the virus, which most people do, you'll have broken, dead bits of virus. These are tiny things, smaller than your cells, perhaps spread all the way through your airway, embedded in bits of mucus, maybe inside an airway lining cell. And so over a period of weeks or months, you bring up cells that contain broken, dead pieces of the virus that you have conquered and killed. However, the PCR test is not able to detect whether the viral RNA has come from a living virus or a dead one, as I've just described. So I think a large proportion of the so-called positives are in fact what I call cold positives. They're correctly identifying that there is some viral RNA in the sample, but it's from a dead virus. It can't hurt them. They're not going to get ill. They can't transmit it to anybody else, so they're not infectious. So that accounts for a large number of the so-called positive cases. These are people who've beaten the virus. Why are we using this test that cannot distinguish between active infection and people who've conquered the virus? This test has never been used in this way, and I've worked in this field. It's not a suitable technique. It's the kind of technique you would use for forensic purposes. If you were trying to do a DNA test to establish whether or not a person was at the scene of a crime, you would not be doing these tests by a windy supermarket car park in what looks like plastic marquee tents on picnic tables. It's not suitable at all, and it definitely shouldn't be done in the way it's being done. It's subject to many mechanical errors, shall we say, handling errors. If this was a test being used for legal purposes, for forensic purposes, like a DNA identity test, the judge would throw out this evidence, would say it's not admissible. It produces positives even when there's no virus there at all. We call that a false positive. As we've increased the number of tests done per day, so we've had to recruit less and less experienced laboratory staff, and now we're using people who've never worked professionally in this area. What that does is it increases the frequency of mistakes, and the effect of this is that the false positive rate rises and rises. So if you had a false positive rate of 1%, which Mr. Matt Hancock told us was roughly the number they had in the summer, then if you tested 1,000 people that had no virus, 10 of them would be positive, astonishingly. If the prevalence of the virus was only 1 in 1,000, that's 0.1%, as the Office of National Statistics told us it was through the summer, then if you use the PCR test, only 1 of them will be positive, and genuinely so. But if the false positive rate is as low as 1%, you'll also get 10 positives that are false. Some people did say to me, well, there'll be a higher percentage of people coming forward for testing in the community, so-called Pillar 2 testing, because they've been instructed only to come if they've got symptoms. But I call BS on that one. I don't think that's true. I know lots of friends and relatives who've been told by an employer, well, you've sat near someone who's tested positive and I don't want you to come back to work until you've got a negative test. I've seen information from many towns in the north, certainly Birmingham was one, Manchester was another, Bolton, where councils, and I really think they were trying to be helpful, were out leafleting the people of their cities saying, we're going to come round and swab you all because we want to track down this virus. Now, once you start testing people more or less randomly, instead of having symptoms, you get the same amount of virus in the population as the Office of National Statistics found, which is at the time was 1 in 1,000. And I've just told you, Matt Hancock confirmed during the summer, they had a false positive rate of about 1%. So that means out of 1,000 people, 10 would test positive and it would be a false result. and only one would test positive and it was correct. This test is monstrously unsuitable for detecting who has live virus in their airway. It's subject to multiple distortions that are worsening as we get into the winter. As the number of tests done per day increase, the number of errors made by these overworked, not very experienced lab staff increase. I think it's not unreasonable to say a best guess of the false positive rate at the moment, what's called the operational false positive rate, is about 5%. 5% of 300,000 is 15,000 positives. I think some of those positives are real. I don't think it's very many. Now, the problem with this false positive issue, it doesn't just stop at, quotes, cases. It extends to people who are unwell and go to hospital. So people who go to hospital having tested positive, and it could be a false positive, and I think most of them are at the moment. If you go to hospital and you've tested positive previously, or you test positive in hospital, you'll be counted now as a COVID admission. Although there are more people in hospital now than a month ago, this is normal for autumn. Regrettably, people catch respiratory viruses and become ill, and some will die. I just don't believe it's got anything to do with COVID-19 anymore. There are more people in intensive care beds now than they were a month or so ago. That's entirely normal. As we move through late autumn and into the early winter, those beds become used. But there aren't more people than is normal for the time of year, and we're not about to run out of capacity, certainly at a national level. But I think you know where this is going now. If you should now die, you'll be counted as a COVID death. But that's not correct. These are people who might have gone to hospital having had a broken leg, for example, but 3% of them will still test positive, and they haven't got the virus. It's a false positive. And if they die, they'll be called a COVID death, and they are not. They've died of something else.